She was 7 months pregnant when her husband looked at her like she was a stranger who had wandered into the wrong room. Dante Bellecourt didn't flinch, didn't stumble over an excuse, didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He just stood there, the most feared man in Manhattan, with another woman wearing his jacket, and he looked at his pregnant wife like she was the one causing a problem. "You knew the kind of man you married," he said. "Listen to me and go home or get out." 7 years, one ring, and a daughter still growing inside her. Amara Whitfield Bellecourt looked at the man she had built her entire life around, and she made a decision that would shatter everything he thought he owned. She took off her ring, set it on his desk, and she walked out. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel small for it, this story is going to stay with you. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Amara does next will leave you speechless. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Amara had never been naive about who Dante Bellecourt was. She knew before she married him. She knew on the day he proposed, when he slid a diamond onto her finger with steady hands and told her, very calmly, that loving him would require a particular kind of courage. She hadn't asked what he meant. She already understood. The Bellecourt name carried weight in this city the way storm clouds carry rain. You felt it before it arrived, and you knew enough to take shelter. But she had loved him anyway. Not the version of him that Manhattan whispered about at dinner parties. Not the man the tabloids occasionally circled with vague, carefully worded accusations. She had loved the version of Dante that existed only in private, the man who couldn't sleep without the television running low in the background, who kept a photograph of his late mother inside the drawer of his nightstand, who once spent 40 minutes trying to fix a leaking kitchen faucet because he refused to admit he didn't know how and couldn't stand the thought of a stranger walking through his home. That was the Dante she had married. The problem with loving a man like that is you spend years trying to keep both versions of him alive at once, the one the world feared and the one only you were allowed to see. It is exhausting work. It requires a specific kind of daily forgetting. You learn to look past things. You learn to smooth over silences. You learn that certain questions, if you love him, you simply do not ask. Amara had been good at that. For 7 years, she had been extraordinarily good at that. She had stepped into the Bellecourt household as his wife and discovered, within the first few months, that there was an entire dimension of his empire that the men around Dante couldn't see because they weren't looking for it. The legitimate side of Bellecourt Holdings was not a cover story. It was a machine and it had been running badly. Contracts mismanaged. Relationships with financial partners slowly eroding. Legal exposure quietly building in corners nobody was tending. Amara had a business degree and an attention to detail that Dante's advisors, most of whom had loyalty but not competence, simply lacked. She hadn't announced herself. She hadn't asked for a title. She had simply started fixing things quietly, methodically, the way she'd always operated, because she understood that the stability of the legitimate side protected everything else, including him. Dante had noticed. He hadn't said much about it, because Dante never said much about anything he valued. But she had seen it in the way he stopped second-guessing the financial side of decisions, in the way certain partners, after speaking with Amara, became far less difficult than they had been before, in the way he occasionally looked at her across a room with something that, on any other man's face, she might have called relief. She had believed that meant something. It turned out she had been investing in a man who was simultaneously investing elsewhere. The night she found out, it had been raining. Not dramatically, not in the kind of theatrical downpour that belongs in a movie, just a steady, miserable Manhattan drizzle that turned the streets into mirrors and made every cab ride feel twice as long. Amara had been at a prenatal appointment that afternoon. The baby was healthy, strong heartbeat. The doctor had smiled and handed her a photograph, the kind that looks like static to everyone except the 2 people it belongs to, and Amara had looked at it in the back seat of the car and felt, for a quiet moment, like everything was going to be fine. She had decided to go to Dante's penthouse. Not because she needed to. She had her own key. She had always had her own key, which had always seemed like a symbol of something, though she'd never been certain exactly what. She went because she wanted to. Because she was 7 months pregnant and tired, and she had good news in her hand, and the person she most wanted to share it with was her husband. She did not call ahead. That was the thing she would come back to, later, in the long months that followed. She had not called ahead. She had simply gone, the way you go to someone you trust completely, because the whole point of trusting someone completely is that you stop performing the small rituals of caution. She let herself in with her key. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer. The lights were on. She could hear voices low, unhurried, the specific register of people who believe they are alone. She walked in. Celeste Vane was standing near the window. She was beautiful in the kind of effortless, deliberately composed way that requires significant effort to maintain. She was wearing Dante's jacket, not draped over her shoulders, the way you might hand a coat to someone who was cold, but settled there with a familiarity that had no innocent explanation. She was laughing at something, and her hand was on the arm of the chair nearest to Dante, and her whole body was positioned toward him with the language of a woman who is comfortable exactly where she is. Dante saw Amara first. She would always remember that. His eyes found her, before Celeste knew anyone had entered the room. And for one fraction of a second, one single, almost imperceptible fraction, something moved across his face. Not guilt, not panic. Something more complicated than either of those things, and gone too fast for her to name it. Then it was gone, and he just looked at her. Celeste turned and registered Amara's presence with a kind of smooth, measured composure that told Amara this woman had thought about this moment before, had perhaps even rehearsed it. Amara stood in the doorway with an ultrasound photograph in her hand and tried to understand what she was seeing. Not because she didn't understand it. She understood it perfectly. She was trying to understand it in the way that people stand in front of a car accident, knowing exactly what happened, unable to stop reconstructing the moment just before. "How long?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Dante didn't answer immediately. He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had spent 7 years learning to read, and she realized, with a nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy, that she could not read him at all right now. That the face looking back at her was the one he wore for enemies and strangers. Not for her. Never in 7 years for her. "How long, Dante?" And then he said it. "You knew the kind of man you married." He didn't raise his voice. Didn't shift his weight. Didn't do anything that acknowledged the weight of what he was saying or to whom he was saying it. "Listen to me and go home or get out." The words landed the way blunt objects land. Not sharp, just heavy, undeniable. She looked at him for a long moment, looked at the ultrasound photograph in her hand, looked back at him. Then she walked to his desk. She pulled off her wedding ring. It caught briefly on her knuckle because her fingers had swollen slightly with pregnancy, which struck her, in that moment, as both terrible and absurd, and she set it down on the surface of the desk, with a sound so small it should not have been audible. "Then I'm getting out." She turned and walked back through the foyer. She pressed the elevator button. She rode down 17 floors in silence. She walked out through the lobby and into the rain, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing, while the city moved around her with total indifference. The ultrasound photograph was still in her hand. She looked at it once more. Then she tucked it into her coat pocket, against her heart. She did not cry on the street. She would not give the night that. She hailed a cab. What Dante Bellecourt did not understand, as he stood in his penthouse with another woman and watched his pregnant wife leave, was that the thing walking out his door was not just a marriage. It was everything he had built that actually held. The first 24 hours, he waited. This was not something Dante Bellecourt typically did. Waiting was for men who didn't have options. Dante always had options. But with Amara, waiting had occasionally been necessary. In the past, she had a temper that needed room to breathe, a sense of dignity that required time to reassert itself before she could come back to a conversation without feeling like she'd lost it. He knew this about her. He had filed it away the way he filed away useful information about everyone important to him. She would call. She would cool down. They would talk. She did not call. 48 hours. He checked his phone with a regularity that would have embarrassed him if anyone had witnessed it. His security chief, Marco, had the sense not to comment on the fact that Dante spent most of Tuesday morning standing near the window of his home office, looking at the Manhattan skyline, without appearing to see any of it. On the third day, a name crossed his desk through one of his attorneys. Whitfield. Amara Whitfield, her maiden name. Filed for a residential lease in a building on the Upper West Side. Kind of building that was clean and quiet, and completely unremarkable, which was exactly where someone who knew how to disappear would go. She had moved, not retreated. Moved, he called her. She picked up on the second ring, which startled him. He had anticipated voicemail. He had prepared, without fully realizing it, for voicemail. Amara, I've retained an attorney, she said. Her voice was calm. Not the cold calm of anger being suppressed. The flat, exhausted calm of a decision already made. You'll receive separation papers within the week. I'm not interested in a negotiation right now. We need to talk about... I'm not negotiating, Dante. A pause. The baby's fine. I have a doctor I trust. I don't need anything from you right now. And she hung up. He stared at his phone. In 14 years of operating in environments where people said things they did not mean and meant things they did not say, Dante Bellecourt had developed deep sensitivity to when something was performance and when something was real. He replayed the 23 seconds of that phone call 3 times in his memory before he acknowledged what he already knew. That was not performance. He told himself she would reconsider. He told himself this with less conviction than he normally brought to telling himself things, and he noticed the deficit, and he did not examine it too closely. Then the work started falling apart. It did not happen at once. It happened the way erosion happens gradually, barely perceptibly, and then suddenly in a way that cannot be ignored. Contract renewal with a financial partner in Boston that should have been routine. The partner's office sent word that they needed to reschedule. No explanation. Dante's business manager followed up. Partner's assistant was vague. The meeting was pushed 3 weeks. Then a discrepancy appeared in the quarterly projections for Bellecourt Holdings' real estate subsidiary. Small, the kind of thing that might have been a data entry error. Except that the real estate subsidiary had not had a data entry error in 4 years, not since Amara had quietly reorganized the way they tracked revenue streams and cross-referenced it with a system she'd designed herself, using consultants she'd hired and managed without announcing it to anyone. A meeting with 3 investors from Chicago, scheduled for the following Thursday, suddenly required additional preparation time. The email was polite. The message underneath it was not. Marco brought it to Dante's attention on a Friday afternoon, laying a folder on Tenna's desk with the particular care of a man delivering information he would rather not deliver. There's a pattern, Marco said carefully. I can see the pattern, Marco. All of it connects to I know what it connects to. Dante closed the folder. Find out who's been managing those accounts since she left and get them in front of me by Monday. Marco nodded and started to leave. And Marco, Dante didn't look up from the desk. Don't let anyone outside this office know what we're looking at. He spent the weekend in the penthouse. Celeste called twice. He didn't answer. He was not ready to think about Celeste in the full light of what she had cost him. Not yet. Not while the more immediate problem was demanding his attention. But the truth was, Celeste wasn't what was occupying his mind. The nursery was. There was a room in the penthouse at the end of the hall, past the guest rooms, that Amara had been slowly putting together over the past 3 months. She hadn't made a production of it. She wasn't the kind of woman who turned things into events. She had simply, piece by piece, accumulated the things she wanted in there. A particular kind of crib she'd researched for 2 weeks, a rocking chair she'd found at an estate sale, and had reupholstered a bookshelf that was already stocked with the picture books she'd been collecting, since before she was even showing. Dante had not entered that room since Amara left. He walked past it on Saturday night on his way to the kitchen and stopped in front of the closed door and stood there for a moment with his hand not quite touching the handle. Then he kept walking. He told himself it was because there was nothing useful inside that room right now. He was not honest with himself about the full reason. On Monday, his team laid out what they'd found, and it was worse than the pattern suggested. 3 separate business relationships, long-standing, valuable, the kind that take years to cultivate and seconds to lose, were showing signs of quiet withdrawal, not public, not dramatic. The kind of withdrawal that comes before the formal withdrawal, when sophisticated parties start protecting themselves against a development they know is coming, even if it hasn't been announced yet. Someone was feeding information to the outside, and the information being fed was precisely the kind that Amara had been the primary custodian of. The implication was obvious. The implication was also, Dante realized with a certainty that bypassed his logic and went straight to something older and more fundamental wrong. Amara would not do this. Not to the business. Not because of any loyalty to him, he had burned that. But she would not hurt the business because she had poured years of herself into it. People do not burn down the things they have built with their own hands. They walk away from them. They grieve them. But they do not burn them. Which meant someone else was doing this. And the information leak had started before Amara left. He went back through the timeline himself. 3 nights with his coffee going cold beside him, working backward through records and communications, cross-referencing access logs with the calendar of events, looking for the moment the seam had opened. He found it. The seam had opened 4 months ago, roughly 2 months before the night in the penthouse, and the access point was inside his own home, specifically inside his penthouse office. The realization arrived like cold water, immediate, clarifying, and deeply unpleasant. He looked at the timeline again. Then he reached for his phone and called Marco. I need everything you have on Celeste Vane. Not background, not the surface file. Everything. Marco was quiet for a moment. How deep? Deep enough to find who she's actually working for. Another pause. Then I'll have something for you by morning. Dante set the phone down and looked at the skyline through the window. The city moved below him, indifferent as always, full of people building things and burning things and calling the difference progress. He thought about a woman standing on a rain-soaked sidewalk with an ultrasound photograph in her hand. He thought about the exact sound of a wedding ring placed on a desk. He had told her to go home or get out, and she had done neither. She had done the third thing, the thing he had apparently convinced himself she was incapable of. She had gone and built something new. She had taken her name back. She had moved into a quiet building and refused his money and called an attorney. And somewhere in that small Upper West Side apartment, she was preparing to have their daughter without him. He had spent 14 years being the most feared man in rooms full of dangerous people. He had apparently never understood, until now, what it looked like when someone who genuinely did not fear him decided to act accordingly. The coffee beside him went cold. He did not sleep. By the time Marco arrived in the morning with the file, Dante already knew what he was going to find. Some part of him had known since the moment he'd looked at the access timeline and felt the shape of what he was looking at. But knowing a thing and reading it in black and white in your own office at 7 in the morning are 2 different experiences. Marco laid the file open on the desk. Her name isn't Vane, Marco said. That's her mother's maiden name. Her father is Silas, Dante said. Marco looked at him. Her father is Silas. Dante closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then opened them. How long has Silas been trying to get inside Bellecourt Holdings? Based on what we're finding now, 3 years. Maybe more. He's been patient. Patient. Dante turned the word over. He knew Silas by reputation, a man who had spent years building leverage against rivals, not through direct confrontation, but through systematic, quiet infiltration. Kind of enemy that was difficult to fight, because by the time you identified the threat, it was already inside. Silas had sent his own daughter, and Dante had let her in. He looked at the file, at the photographs of Celeste, at events he'd attended, at the dates, at the timeline of her appearances in his life, reconstruct it now with the clarity of information he should have had and didn't. Then he looked at something else Marco had included at the bottom of the file, a photograph, taken with a long lens, of Amara leaving a prenatal clinic 3 days ago alone, moving carefully in the way that pregnant women in their 3rd trimester move with deliberate attention, one hand occasionally touching the doorframe for balance, the other holding a tote bag that seemed heavier than it needed to be. She was alone because he had made her alone. That was the sentence that formed in his mind, and he did not try to qualify it or redistribute the weight of it. He had made her alone. He had given Silas's daughter access to his home and his trust in his marriage. And he had handed the single person most capable of protecting his legitimate empire a reason to walk out the door. And she was out there. 7 months pregnant, soon to be 8, alone, in possession of security protocols and access codes she'd designed, which meant Silas already knew she had them, And Silas was not the kind of man who let a loose end stay loose. Dante stood up. Where is she right now? Marco checked his phone. Upper West Side. She has an appointment tomorrow morning. Prenatal, regular checkup. Ton. I want 2 cars outside that building tonight. Discreet. No contact, no approach. I'm not trying to frighten her. Just eyes. He stopped. And Marco, if anything changes, if you see anything that looks wrong, you call me before you do anything else. You understand? Understood. Dante looked once more at the photograph in the file. The woman who had removed his ring and set it on his desk with the kind of quiet dignity that he hadn't fully recognized for what it was until now. He had looked at her like she was the intrusion. He had told her to obey him or leave, and she had done exactly what he should have always known she was capable of. And now she was walking through a city that contained his enemies, carrying his child, and she didn't know that the woman who had destroyed their marriage hadn't done it for love. She had done it for access, and the access she was really after had always been Amara. Dante picked up his phone. He had a great deal of work to do, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the urgency he felt had nothing to do with money or leverage or the preservation of his empire. It had everything to do with the woman on the sidewalk, the woman he had told to leave, the woman who, God help him, had listened. The 2 cars Marco sent were a black sedan and a gray SUV, both unremarkable, both parked on opposite ends of the block outside Amara's building by 9:30 that night. Dante had specified discreet. Marco knew what discreet meant in practice: no engine running, no movement unless necessary, and nobody who looked like they were watching. It was the best they could do. It was not enough, and Dante knew it, but he had no standing to do more. He had no standing to do anything right now except sit in his penthouse and wait for a morning report and try not to think about the nursery door at the end of the hall. He did not sleep. He had told Marco he wouldn't sleep, not in those words. But Marco had left a thermos of coffee on the desk, without being asked, which was its own kind of communication. By 3 in the morning, Dante had read through the Celeste file twice more and built a timeline on paper, actual paper, a legal pad, the kind of physical record he could look at from different angles. He had learned a long time ago that digital screens flattened information. Paper let you see the shape of things. The shape of this was ugly. Celeste had entered his orbit 14 months ago. A charity event, the kind of event Dante attended because certain business relationships required it, and not for any other reason. She had been introduced through a mutual acquaintance, whose name, when Dante looked at it now, sent a cold, deliberate recognition through him. The introduction had been engineered. Every subsequent encounter had been engineered. The relationship that had developed had been, from her side, entirely engineered. Dante was not a man who was easily maneuvered. He had survived in environments where manipulation was the primary currency by developing an almost pathological awareness of it. The fact that Celeste had gotten through those defenses told him 2 things. She was extraordinarily skilled, and she had been given specific intelligence about him, his patterns, his vulnerabilities, the precise shape of what he would respond to, which meant Silas had been studying him for a long time before he sent her, and the study had included Amara. Silas had known that Dante's marriage was the one relationship in his life that operated outside his usual vigilance, that Amara was the one person Dante trusted in a way that bypassed his instincts, that if you could compromise that trust, if you could detonate the marriage from the inside, you would leave Dante not just emotionally destabilized, but operationally exposed. Because the legitimate infrastructure of Bellecourt Holdings, the part that interfaced with the outside world, had been running on Amara's competence for years. Remove Amara, access her systems, blame her for the breach. Dante stared at the legal pad. Celeste had photographed documents. Marco's team had found the evidence of it, a specific app on a device registered under a shell name. Timestamps that matched night Celeste had been in the penthouse. The documents she'd accessed were financial. Specific. The kind of specific that told you exactly who had designed the system and exactly how to get inside it. She hadn't been after Dante's criminal infrastructure. That was the almost darkly ironic part. She had been after the legitimate side, the side Amara built, because that was the side with the actual money, the actual exposure, and the actual leverage over Dante's long-term future. Silas was sophisticated enough to understand that the criminal side of an organization like Bellacort's was difficult to attack directly, too much redundancy, too many layers. But the legitimate side? The legitimate side had board members, investors, regulatory relationships, contracts with entities that could not afford public association with scandal. If you could destabilize that, you could bring Dante Bellacourt to his knees without firing a single shot. And the destabilization had started the night Amara walked out. Dante set down the legal pad and looked at the thermos of coffee. He picked it up and found it was cold. He drank it anyway. At some point, the city outside began its shift from nighttime to early morning, that specific quality of light that is not yet dawn but is no longer dark, gray, and slightly grainy, the way old photographs look. Dante watched it happen through the window and thought about the fact that Amara was in a building across the park, probably not sleeping either, and that she had no idea that the woman who had destroyed her marriage had done it with a specific operational objective. He had not protected her. He had, in fact, handed her directly to the threat. The thought sat in his chest with a weight he did not try to move. Marco arrived at 7:15 with 2 men from the security team and a look on his face that Dante recognized as the prelude to worse news. Overnight was clean, Marco said first, which was the one piece of information Dante needed immediately. No activity around her building. She's fine. Dante exhaled once. What else? Marco looked at the 2 men, the younger one Torres, set a laptop on the desk and turned it to face Dante. On the screen was a communication thread encrypted, partially decoded by Bellacourt's tech team overnight. Celeste has been in contact with Silas's operation through a third-party relay, Marco said. We found the relay last night. We can't read everything, but we can read enough. Dante leaned forward. He read the visible fragments without speaking. His face did not change. The men in the room had worked for him long enough to know that the stillness was not calm. She planted something, Dante said. It wasn't a question. Evidence. Specifically digital evidence, suggesting that the financial discrepancies we found were initiated from Amara's old access credentials. Marco said it carefully. The way you handle something's breakable. Someone who didn't know to look deeper would conclude that my wife didn't touch those accounts. I know that. I know you know that. I'm saying it so it's said out loud in this room. Dante straightened. Who else has seen this planted evidence? Right now? Just us. But Silas's people will expect it to surface. They'll probably move to surface it themselves if we don't find a way to. They'll use it to apply pressure, Dante said. Not publicly. They'll threaten to release it. To our financial partners. Maybe to certain regulatory contacts. The implication being Bellacourt's own wife sabotaged his company on her way out. He turned away from the laptop. It's actually clean work. Torres looked uncomfortable with that assessment. Marco didn't. The question, Dante continued, is what Silas actually wants. He has the planted evidence. He has whatever Celeste photographed. He has the access codes Amara used to use. He stopped, except he doesn't. Marco waited. The codes she used. She rotated them. Quarterly. It was her system, she built it, she maintained it. She rotated the credentials herself without logging the rotation in the main system, because she didn't trust the main system's security. Dante almost smiled. Almost. Silas's people have whatever she was using 6 months ago. None of it works anymore. So they have documents, but not access. Marco said slowly. Which means, Dante said that Silas still needs something. And the only person who has what he needs is Amara. He picked up his phone, which means the overnight being clean was the last clean night we're going to have. He called Amara. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the outgoing message was brisk and professional. The tone she used for business not cold, just efficient. You've reached Amara Whitfield. Leave a message. It's me. He stopped, restarted. I know you don't want to hear from me. I need you to listen anyway. Don't go to your appointment alone this morning. I'll explain everything, but I need you to call me back first. Please. He hung up. He looked at the phone. He called Marco. Move the cars closer. I don't care if she notices them. Amara noticed them. She was standing at her kitchen window with a cup of herbal tea she'd given up coffee 3 months ago, a sacrifice that had seemed minor at the time, and now felt like a daily punishment watching the street below, because she had developed the habit of watching the street below. Not out of fear exactly. More out of the accumulated awareness of what it meant to be Dante Bellecourt's wife, even an estranged one. You didn't stop paying attention. Paying attention was how you stayed safe. The black sedan was trying too hard to look like nothing. She'd known what Dante's security vehicles looked like. For years, they all had that quality of careful unremarkability, which was its own kind of marker if you knew what you were looking for. She looked at the sedan for a long moment. Then she looked at her phone. Dante had called at 7:42. The voicemail was sitting there. She knew it was his voice before she played it, because only one number came up as a contact she still hadn't deleted, and she'd had several weeks to deal with that particular failure of decisiveness and had chosen not to examine it too closely. Played the message. Don't go to your appointment alone this morning. I'll explain everything, but I need you to call me back first. Please. She listened to it twice, not because she needed to hear it again, because she was trying to read the tone, and the tone was wrong for Dante in a way she couldn't immediately categorize. He had said please. Dante Bellecourt did not say please. He phrased requests as statements and statements as conclusions, and he inhabited the space of any conversation like a man who had already decided how it was going to go. He had said please, and his voice had carried something she had not heard from him in a very long time. He sounded afraid. She set the phone down, picked it up, set it down again. Her appointment was at 10. It was now 8:15. She had been planning to take a cab the way she had taken a cab to every appointment for the past month, sitting in the back with her tote bag and her folder of medical records, and the careful discipline of a woman who has decided to manage her own life and is doing so systematically. Called her attorney instead. Sandra Peel had been practicing family law in Manhattan for 22 years and had a voice like a woman who had stopped being surprised by anything around year 4. She picked up on the first ring. Amara, what's happened? Dante left me a voicemail telling me not to go to my prenatal appointment alone. Amara kept her voice level, and there are 2 of his cars outside my building. A short silence. Did he threaten you? No. He said please. She paused. He never says please. Okay. Sandra's voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but more attentive. What does your instinct tell you? Amara looked at the street, at the sedan sitting there in its deliberate unremarkableness. That something's wrong. Not with him. With something around both of us. Do you want me to reach out to his legal team and ask for an explanation? Not yet. She pressed her fingers against the counter. The baby moved a slow, rolling motion, the kind that had been happening for weeks now. So familiar it should have been unremarkable, and somehow never was. Let me call him. She hung up with Sandra and stood in her kitchen for a moment, one hand flat on the counter, one hand resting, without thinking, against the side of her stomach. Then she called him back. He picked up before the first ring finished. She had been right. He had been holding the phone. Thank you for calling, he said. Don't. Her voice was steady. Don't do the voice. Just tell me what's happening. A beat. Celeste Vane isn't who I thought she was. He said it without any of the usual architecture he put around difficult things, no build-up, no framing, just the sentence itself. She's been running an operation against Bellecourt Holdings for over a year. She was sent by a man named Silas, her father. Amara was quiet. She photographed documents in my penthouse. She planted evidence designed to make it look like you took confidential materials when you left. Another pause. And she's been trying to access the financial systems you managed, which she can't, because the credentials she has are 6 months out of date. Amara understood immediately what that meant. She felt the understanding arrive not in her mind, but somewhere lower, more physical, a slow, cold compression in her chest. They're going to come to me, she said. Yes, because I'm the only one who has what they actually need. Yes. She moved away from the window instinctively. How long have you known this? I've been building it since Monday. I confirmed the core of it last night. A pause that had weight to it. I should have seen it sooner. I didn't. That's on me. I'm not interested in your accountability right now, Dante. I'm interested in what my exposure looks like. She heard him exhale. That's why I don't want you going to that appointment alone. If Silas's people have been watching you, your cars outside my building are not a deterrent. They're a signal. She felt a flicker of anger that was old and new at once. Old because it was built on weeks of it. New because it had a fresh specific reason now. If someone is watching my building and they see your cars, they don't back off. They adjust. You've just told them you know something. A silence. You're right, he said. She almost said something about how strange was it to hear those two words from him as well. She didn't. Pull the cars. Pull them now. Amara. If you want to help me, pull the obvious surveillance and replace it with something Silas's people won't recognize. You have people who can do that. Use them. And do not contact me again through channels they might be monitoring. She was already thinking. Already moving through the problem the way she had always moved through problems, not from fear, but from the part of her that operated best under pressure. I'm going to my appointment. I'll take a different route. I'll call you from a new number when I'm back. I'll have someone. No. You'll pull the cars and let me move. Her voice had taken on an edge she hadn't intended. You've spent weeks assuming I needed you to manage what happens to me. I'm the one who's been managing things, Dante. Let me manage this. She ended the call. Her hands were not shaking. She checked. She went to her bedroom and changed into different clothes. Nothing she'd worn outside recently. Nothing that would look the same to anyone who'd been cataloging her habits. She pulled her hair back differently. She chose a coat she'd bought since leaving, one that Dante's people wouldn't have a photograph of. Small adjustments, the kind that added up to a woman who was harder to track in a city full of people. She had learned to think this way living with Dante. She had absorbed it the way you absorb things from the person you share a life with, without meaning to, without even fully noticing. She grabbed her tote bag, her medical folder, a prepaid phone she'd purchased 3 weeks ago for reasons Bruce hadn't fully calculated, even to herself, some animal instinct that had said keep a layer nobody knows about. She used the service elevator. She exited through the building's back parking structure. She did not see the man who saw her leave. His name in the operational file Silas kept was listed only as Rourke. He had been watching the building for 4 days. Not from the street that was amateur positioning, in a city where people looked at their phones and not their surroundings, but where professional surveillance teams knew to expect counter-surveillance from the kind of household he was working against. Rourke was watching from a service office in the building, directly across the alley. Second floor, facing east. He had a clear sightline to the back exit. He texted one line to an encrypted number when he saw the woman in the dark coat move through the parking structure. Target mobile. Moving east on foot. The response came back in under a minute. Don't intercept. Follow. Wait for instruction. Rourke pocketed the phone and picked up his jacket. Sandra Peel called Dante's legal team at 9:47, using the direct number she had on file from the separation proceedings. She reached a junior attorney named Howe, who had the tone of a man who was used to being the informational filter between his clients and people his clients did not want to speak with directly. Miss Peel, Howe said with practiced neutrality, I'm calling on behalf of my client, Amara Whitfield, regarding a matter that appears to be adjacent to the Bellacourt separation, but not strictly within its scope. Sandra was already standing when she made calls like this, a habit she'd developed years ago, because standing made her voice carry differently. My client has received communication from her estranged husband, suggesting she may be at risk from a third party connected to Bellacourt business interests. A short pause on Howe's end. I'd need to discuss any such matter directly with. I'm not asking you to confirm or deny anything about your client's business, Mr. Howe. I'm informing you that if anything happens to Amara Whitfield as a result of her proximity to those business interests, the legal and reputational implications for Bellacourt Holdings will be immediate and substantial. She let that land. I trust you'll pass that to whoever needs to hear it. She ended the call. Howe had the call forwarded to Dante's desk inside 6 minutes, which was actually faster than Sandra had expected. Dante was not at his desk. He was standing outside the penthouse elevator, in his coat, about to leave, when Marco intercepted him with the message. Sandra Peel called. She's covering her bases. She's protecting Amara. That's her job. He punched the elevator button. Where is Amara right now? East side. She went out the back. Our guys on the front didn't see her leave. Marco said without flinching, because flinching at bad news in front of Dante was pointless. We picked her up 2 blocks east of the building on secondary camera coverage. She's moving toward the clinic. And we have a secondary contact informational, not ours who flagged a tail. Dante went very still. Someone's following her, Marco said quietly. The elevator doors opened. Dante stepped in. Get the car, he said. Marco was already on the phone. The elevator descended. Dante watched the floor numbers drop and did not think about the ultrasound photograph he had never asked to see. Did not think about the nursery at the end of the hall. Did not let himself think about the specific quality of her voice on the phone that morning. Steady, competent, furious in the deep. Controlled way of a woman who has stopped wasting anger on the person who caused it and is now directing all of it towards solving the problem. She had told him to let her manage it. She hadn't known someone was already behind her. The lobby doors opened onto the street, and the car was waiting, and the city was doing what the city always did, moving. Relentlessly, full of people with no knowledge of what was happening, 20 feet from them, and Dante got in and gave the address to the driver and looked out the window at Manhattan going past and felt something he had not felt since he was young and had not yet learned to convert fear into control. He felt it plain, without the conversion, without the management of it. He was afraid for someone else. He had not been afraid for someone else in a very long time. The car accelerated. Marco was on the phone in the front seat, coordinating, his voice low and clipped. Dante heard the words East Side and 4 blocks, and don't let him get close, and none of it felt like enough. Because the woman moving through that city with a medical folder in her tote bag and a prepaid phone she'd bought, for reasons she'd never fully articulated to herself, that woman had spent a month proving she didn't need him to manage anything. The problem was that the person following her didn't know that, and Silas did not send people to observe. He sent people who waited for a moment of isolation, and then he sent a message. Car ran a yellow light, and Marco turned in the front seat and looked at Dante with an expression that said everything the situation required and nothing extra. She turned onto Lexington, Marco said. She's 3 minutes from the clinic. And the tail? Marco's jaw tightened by a fraction. Just a fraction. Closing. Dante looked at the city outside the window. Every block between the car and his wife felt like something that could not be taken back. Every second felt like the distance between the man he had been 2 weeks ago, the man who had stood in his own penthouse and told a pregnant woman to obey him or get out, and the man sitting in the back of a car realizing, with an absolute and irrevocable clarity, that the world had continued moving while he stood still in his arrogance. There were no second chances in the next 3 minutes. There's only what happened next, and it had already started without him. The car hit the intersection at Lexington and 73rd, doing 40 in a 30 zone, and Marco had both hands braced on the dashboard, even though he wasn't driving, which told Dante everything about how the next 90 seconds were going to feel. Visual, Dante said. Marco had the phone pressed to his ear. Torres has eyes on her. She's on foot, north side of the street, moving toward the clinic's entrance. A pause while someone spoke into the other end. The tail is male, mid-30s, dark jacket. He's been keeping about half a block back, but he closed distance when she turned off Park. Where's our closest man on foot? 2 blocks south. That's not close enough. I know. Dante looked out the window at the city, doing its indifferent morning thing. People with coffee cups. A delivery truck double-parked, with a stroller waiting at a crosswalk, and he made a decision in the way that he made decisions when options were narrowing, which was to stop calculating and move. Stop the car. The driver looked in the rearview mirror. Stop the car. I'll go on foot faster than we'll get through this block. Marco started to say something. Dante was already opening the door. He moved through the pedestrian traffic, the way he'd moved through difficult spaces his entire adult life, not pushing, not running, just finding the lines between people with the practiced economy of a man who understood how bodies occupied space. He was in a suit with no coat, which was a mistake he registered and filed away as irrelevant. The October air hit him clean and cold, and he turned north on Lexington and picked up his pace. He spotted Torres, first one of his security men, positioned on the opposite sidewalk with a coffee cup he wasn't drinking from, eyes tracking something ahead of him. Dante followed the track. Amara was 40 feet ahead, moving steadily, dark coat, her tote bag on her left shoulder, her right hand held slightly away from her body, the way she carried herself when her back was aching, a thing she did in the last trimester, that he had noticed without commenting on, filed away in the same internal archive, where he kept everything he'd observed about her over 7 years. The man in the dark jacket was 20 feet behind her. Dante recognized the positioning immediately. Not aggressive. Not closing yet. The specific distance of someone who is waiting, measuring, identifying the right moment of isolation. The clinic entrance was half a block ahead. If she went inside, the moment was gone. If she stopped, if she paused for any reason, a crosswalk, a phone call, a moment of discomfort, the moment was there. Dante crossed the street without breaking stride. He came up behind the man in the dark jacket from the left, which put Dante between him and the street, and he said very quietly, "Walk with me," in the tone he used for people who understood what it meant when someone with his particular reputation used that tone. The man turned. He was younger than Dante expected. Mid-30s, solid build, the flat, careful eyes of someone professionally trained to show nothing. He registered Dante's face, and something shifted in those eyes, not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a man who has just understood that his operational picture was missing a significant element. "I don't know who you were following my wife." Dante was still walking, and the man was moving with him now, because the alternative was a scene on a public street, and whatever his instruction were, a scene was not among them. "You have about 30 seconds before the two men behind you make this a different kind of conversation, so talk to me." The man's jaw tightened. He glanced back, once saw Torres closing from one direction, and the driver who had abandoned the car coming from the other. "I was told to observe and report," the man said. The words came out clipped, reluctant, the specific rhythm of someone providing the minimum. Report to who? A pause that went on too long. Dante stopped walking and looked at him directly for the first time. "You have a very small window to be useful to me. Past that window, you become a problem I hand to different people. Understand what I'm saying to you." The man looked at him, made a calculation. "Rourke. I work for Rourke. He's coordinating for Silas's operation locally. Where is Rourke right now? I don't know. We work in cells. I have a contact number, nothing else. What were you told about the woman you were following?" The man hesitated in a way that was specific, not uncertainty, but the hesitation of someone who knows that what they're about to say is going to change the temperature of the conversation. "They said she has access codes, financial systems. They want to make contact and acquire the codes before Bellacourt's people can secure them." Another pause. "I was told she was estranged, not protected." Dante looked at the man for a moment that had no specific duration. "Not protected," he repeated. "That's what I was told." Dante nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when someone had confirmed something he already knew, but needed to hear spoken aloud so he could build from it. He turned to Torres, who had arrived at his shoulder. "Take him somewhere quiet and get the contact number for Rourke. Then hold him." He said it without drama, the way you give ordinary instructions. Then he turned and walked toward the clinic entrance. Amara was gone from the sidewalk. She had gone inside. He pushed through the glass door and into the lobby pale walls, the smell of antiseptic underneath something floral. A reception desk staffed by a woman in her 50s, who looked up at Dante with the practice of professional assessment of someone who spent her days managing the particular emotional range of people in waiting rooms. "Sir, my wife is a patient here. Amara Whitfield." He stopped at the desk. "I need you to tell her I'm in the lobby." The woman's expression did not change in any way that indicated she was going to simply do that. "Sir, I'm not able to, please." He said it the same way he'd said it on the voicemail. The word still felt foreign in his mouth. He was using it anyway. "Tell her Dante is in the lobby. She can decide whether she wants to come out." The woman looked at him for a moment. Something in his face he had no idea what exactly made her pick up the phone. He stood at the desk with his hands at his sides and waited. Amara was in an examination room when the nurse knocked and relayed the message. She was sitting on the edge of the examination table in the paper gown that was too short and too thin for October and made everyone who wore it feel immediately vulnerable, which was its own particular cruelty. She had been sitting there long enough to have reviewed her blood pressure, reading twice in her head, and concluded that it was elevated in a way her doctor was going to comment on. She heard the nurse say Dante's name and felt the information arrive in her body before she'd finished processing it, a specific tightening across her shoulders, something in her stomach that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "Tell him I'll be out after my appointment," she said. The nurse nodded and left. Amara sat in the paper gown and breathed. In. Out. The baby moved again, that same rolling motion, lower now, which the doctor had told her 2 weeks ago, meant the baby was settling into position. preparing, moving towards something without knowing that's what she was doing. She had not told Dante the gender. He knew it was a girl she had said that much in the weeks before everything collapsed. But she hadn't told him the name she'd chosen. She wasn't sure why she was thinking about that right now. Probably because thinking about the name was better than thinking about a man in a dark jacket who had been behind her on Lexington Avenue and who had closed distance when she turned and who might have been nothing, might have been a coincidence, but who Dante had apparently gone directly to, because when she'd glanced back, glanced back through the clinic's glass door, she had seen Dante's profile on the sidewalk in conversation with someone. And then she'd looked away because she was not going to stand in a clinic doorway, watching her estranged husband handle things on a public street like a scene from a movie she hadn't agreed to be in. Her doctor came in 12 minutes later. Dr. Reyes was in her mid-40s, brisk without being cold, the kind of doctor who gave you information in the same register she'd used to tell you the weather and trusted you to handle it. Blood pressure is up a little, Dr. Reyes said, looking at the chart. I know. Stress? Yes. Dr. Reyes looked at her over the chart with the expression of a woman who had been practicing obstetrics long enough to know which patients she needed to push and which one she needed to simply observe. We'll monitor it. Everything else looks good. She's in position. Good weight. Heartbeat is strong. She set the chart down. How are you sleeping? Adequately. That's not a reassuring word. It's an accurate one. Dr. Reyes made a note. You have 6 weeks. Maybe 5 if she decides she's ready early. I want to see you in 10 days instead of 2 weeks. And Amara, the stress is going to affect her too. Whatever is happening outside this room, you need to find a way to put some of it down. Amara looked at her. I'm working on it. Work faster. She left Amara to get dressed. Amara sat in the silence of the examination room for a moment after the door closed and let herself feel the full weight of what was happening, not process it, not plan around it. Just feel it. The paper gown crinkled when she moved. The fluorescent light above her hummed at a frequency slightly below audible. She was 8 months pregnant, alone in a clinical room, and the man who had told her to obey him or leave was sitting in the lobby because someone had been following her through the streets of her own city. She thought about Dr. Reyes's face when she said work faster. She thought about the baby settling into position, moving towards something without knowing what it was. She got dressed. Dante was standing near the window when she came out, not sitting in the waiting room chairs. Like the other people there, a couple in their 30s, a woman reading a magazine, a man asleep with his chin on his chest. He was standing because sitting would have required a patience he didn't have available right now, and he had enough self-awareness to know that projecting impatience in a prenatal clinic waiting room was not useful, so he had taken himself to the window and looked at the street and waited. He heard her before he saw her. The specific rhythm of her walk, a little slower than usual, deliberate in the way she'd been moving for the past 2 months, with that additional weight she was still adjusting to. He turned. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at him since the night in the penthouse. Not with anger. Anger had a heat to it. This was cooler and more thorough, the assessment of someone who has taken a person apart in their mind and rebuilt them according to accurate specifications, and is now looking at the rebuilt version without the filters that used to soften the view. She's healthy, Amara said. She was talking about the baby, not giving him anything more than that. I'm glad. He meant it simply. He had learned, in the past few weeks, that simple was the only register she'd accept from him, and he was still adjusting to that, because simple had never been his natural mode. What happened outside? The man following you works for Silas's local coordinator. He was observing you. He had a contact number my people have him. He kept it factual. He was told you weren't protected. Something moved across her face. Not shock. Something more tired than shock. Come outside, she said. I don't want to talk about this in here. They walked out together and stood on the sidewalk. The October air was clean and cold, the kind of morning that had no interest in anyone's particular difficulties. People moved past them in both directions. How much do you know about what Silas actually wants? She asked. He wants the access codes you used to control the financial infrastructure. He has documents Celeste photographed, but he can't use them without the current credentials. He's been building toward making contact with you. I just didn't know how fast he'd move. Amara was quiet for a moment. I changed those codes 3 weeks after I left. I've changed them twice more since. She looked at the street. He doesn't know that. No, he's been operating on the assumption that you still have active access, and that you're isolated enough to leverage. She turned her head and looked at him with an expression he had seen before, not often, but memorably. The expression of a mind that is several steps ahead of the current conversation and is deciding how much of where it's going to share. He's going to make contact himself, she said. Rourke is a mid-level coordinator. The tale was his resource. Silas knows by now that it was interrupted. He'll escalate. She paused. He'll come at me directly. Somewhere I can't easily be helped. Dante looked at her. Which is why you're not going anywhere alone until... I'm not asking for your protection plan, Dante. Her voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised. It was compressed, which was worse. I'm telling you what's going to happen next so we can think about it clearly. Because thinking clearly is apparently something we're capable of when we're not standing in your penthouse. She stopped, took a breath. What do your attorneys have that we can use? Documentation-wise. We have the decoded communication fragments between Celeste and Silas's relay. We have the access log showing when Celeste photographed documents, and from where. We have the timeline demonstrating the planted evidence was created before you left. Is it enough to take to authorities? Not yet. It's circumstantial. We need Silas to act. We need him to try to use what he has, or to make contact with you in a way that's documented. Amara looked at him for a long moment. You want to use me as bait. I want to offer you that option. It's different. Is it? Yes. He said it plainly. You can walk away from this right now. Sandra Peel can get an injunction. We can put private security around you for the remainder of your pregnancy. And I can fight Silas's leverage on the business side separately. You can stay completely clear of this. And the financial partners who are already withdrawing, the planted evidence that's going to surface publicly if Silas decides that's how he wants to apply pressure. Dante said nothing. I built those relationships, Amara said. 4 of those 5 business partnerships exist because I spent 2 years cultivating them. I know what it took. I know what it would take to rebuild them if they collapse. She turned to look at the street again. I'm not walking away from them because of Celeste Vane and her father. Amara, don't. She looked back at him, and now there was something in her eyes that was not the cool clinical assessment of before. It was something sharper and more alive and more dangerous. Don't manage me. I've made a decision. Help me figure out how to execute it. He looked at her. 8 months pregnant on a Manhattan sidewalk in October, tote bag over her shoulder, medical folder under her arm, the baby settling into position inside her, and a look on her face that he recognized belatedly, as was becoming a pattern as exactly the look that had kept his empire running for 4 years while he was busy, believing it was running itself. All right, he said. I need a secure location. Not the penthouse anywhere associated with you directly is compromised. I need to be somewhere that looks accessible, but that we control. She was already organizing it in her mind. He could see the process happening in real time in the small, precise movements of her eyes. And I need Silas to believe I'm both vulnerable and motivated. That I'm angry enough at you, consider dealing with him independently. Dante absorbed this. That's not going to be difficult for him to believe. No, she agreed. It's not. She looked at him with an expression that was briefly, almost invisibly, something other than strategic. It's not difficult, because most of it is still true. He didn't flinch from that. He was learning not to flinch from true things. The separation papers are already filed, she continued. Publicly, we're estranged. I'm an 8 months pregnant woman who caught her husband with another woman and walked out. I have motive to want leverage over Bellacourt Holdings. She shifted the tote bag on her shoulder. Silas will approach me. I want to be ready when he does. Marco had the Rourke contact extracted, and a trace running by noon. The trace led to a registered business address in Midtown, a consulting firm with a name generic enough to be invisible, 3 employees on paper, a lease signed 18 months ago. The kind of setup you built when you were planning to need it for a limited time, and then abandon it cleanly. Marco laid it out for Dante in the car on the way back to a property Dante kept under a subsidiary name, a brownstone on the Upper East Side, used for nothing in particular, which made it ideal for something like this. Silas doesn't have a Manhattan office, Marco said. He operates out of Chicago primarily, but he's been here. We found hotel records under a name that traces back to one of his shell entities he checked in 10 days ago. He came to oversee it personally. That's what it looks like. Dante looked out the window. He's more invested in this than I thought. The financial infrastructure Amara built, it's worth being invested in. From the outside, looking at what we've documented about his interest in it, it looks like Cecil's has been losing ground to Bellacourt's legitimate operations for 2 years. Our financial partners are the same pool he's been trying to draw from. Every relationship she built was one he didn't get. Dante said nothing for a moment. Then, this was never just about leverage. He wants to absorb what she built. That's my read. Which means he doesn't want to destroy it. He wants to take it intact. Dante turned from the window. Which means he needs her. Not just the codes. He needs someone who understands how the whole system works. Because the codes are only part of it. The relationship infrastructure, the way things connect, that's in her head. Marco nodded slowly. He's going to ask her to work for him. The sentence landed in the car, with a weight that required a moment to settle. He's going to come to her, Dante said, and he's going to make her an offer. After everything, he's going to sit across from her and tell her that he can give her what she actually deserves: compensation, recognition, independence from a man who told her to obey him or leave. Marco was quiet, and it's going to be a credible offer, Dante continued, because it's going to be built on real things, real grievances, real opportunities. He looked at his hands briefly, the way he occasionally looked at them when he was thinking. He's been studying her as long as he's been studying me. She needs to know the full scope of what he's going to offer, Marco said carefully. Not just the threat, the pitch, yes. Dante looked up. Set up a meeting with her and our attorney. Tonight, the brownstone. He paused. And Marco, don't contact her through any channel we've used before. Give her the new number I texted her from this morning, and use that only. Marco made the call. The brownstone was narrow and old, and smelled like a building that had been cleaned recently but not lived in for a while, that specific combination of lemon and dormancy that no amount of fresh air quite erases. Amara arrived at 7 that evening with Sandra Peel, who had the particular alertness of an attorney who had been given partial information and was reserving judgment about the rest. Dante was already there. So was Marco, and a woman named Lee, who handled the legal documentation side of Bellacourt's sensitive matters, and who Amara had met once before, years ago, and had liked immediately for reasons she'd never fully articulated. They sat around a table in the main room. No pleasantries. Amara had specifically communicated through Sandra that she did not want pleasantries, and Dante had passed that to the room before she arrived. Lee laid out the documentation first, what they had, what it established, what it still needed to be actionable. Amara listened with her hands folded on the table and asked 2 questions, both procedural, both precise. Then Dante said, "There's something else you need to know about what Silas is going to offer you." Amara looked at him. "He's not going to threaten you. That's not his approach, not with someone like you." Dante leaned forward slightly. "He's going to offer you a position inside his operation. He's going to tell you that everything you built deserves to be recognized, that you've been undervalued, that he can give you independence and compensation, and a role that reflects what you actually do." He paused. "He's going to be persuasive because he's been watching you long enough to know exactly what to say." Sandra Peel made a small sound that might have been a lawyer's approximation of disbelief. Amara did not make any sound. "He'll have numbers," Dante continued. "Real ones. Structured for someone who has done the homework on what your work is worth." Another pause. "Pitch is going to be built on everything that's true about how I failed to recognize what you contributed. He's going to use my failures as a recruitment argument." The room was quiet. "And he'd be right," Dante said. The words came out evenly, without the defensive scaffolding that usually surrounded difficult admissions from him. Everything he'd say about that would be accurate. That's what makes it dangerous. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression was complicated in a way she didn't try to simplify. Then she looked back at Lee. "If I agree to meet with him voluntarily, documented, with a secure recording, and he makes this offer, what does that give us legally? A solicitation to engage in industrial espionage, potentially. Conspiracy to commit financial fraud, given the planted evidence component. If he reveals knowledge of the Celeste operation in the course of making the offer," Lee was already nodding, "it gives us significantly more than what we have now. Can we guarantee Amara's physical safety during such a meeting? Sandra's voice was measured but pointed. We control the location, Marco said. We design it. She's never alone. She'd appear to be alone, Dante said. That's the point. That's what brings him. Sandra looked at Amara. This is your call. I want to be clear about that in front of everyone in this room. Amara knew it was her call. She had known it was her call since this morning on the sidewalk when she looked at Dante and told him she wasn't walking away from what she'd built. She had known it the way she knew things that bypassed analysis, in the part of her that operated before logic, the same part that had made her buy the prepaid phone 3 weeks ago. Because something had said, keep a layer nobody knows about. Set it up, she said. Sandra made a note. Lee made a note. Marco looked at Dante, who was looking at Amara, with an expression he wasn't managing for once, not managing it at all, and she caught him looking and held his gaze for a moment before she looked away. One condition, Amara said. I run the meeting. Not you, not Marco, not anyone else. I decide what I say, and when I say it, and how far I let him go before we close it. She looked at Dante. This is my play. You're the support structure. Nothing else. Dante's jaw shifted slightly. Just slightly. Understood, he said. Amara picked up her folder. Then let's figure out how to make Silas believe I'm ready to betray my husband. She said husband without hesitation, and the word fell into the room, and nobody commented on it. And Amara did not offer any clarification. And Dante did not allow himself to make anything of it in the presence of other people. He stored it in the same internal archive, where he kept everything he'd observed about her. It was at this point a very full archive. The contact came 2 days later, not through Rourke, not through any intermediary. A message, delivered by hand to the reception desk of the building where Sandra Peel had her offices, which meant Silas knew Amara had retained an attorney, knew which attorney, and had someone close enough to deliver a physical message to that address without being observed doing it. A single card, no letterhead. A Manhattan address, a private club in Midtown that Amara recognized as the kind of place that existed in the overlap between legitimate wealth and the kind of arrangements that didn't get written down, and a time. Thursday noon. And at the bottom of the card, handwritten in a clean, deliberate script, I know what you built. I know what you're owed. Come alone. Sandra photographed it and called Dante's legal team within the hour. Amara held the card in her hand for a moment before she gave it to Sandra. She looked at the handwriting. I know what you built. I know what you're owed. She thought about the nursery at the end of the hall in the penthouse. The one she'd put together piece by piece, quietly, without making it an event. The crib she'd researched. The rocking chair from the estate sale. Picture books on the shelf. She thought about 7 years. She put the card on Sandra's desk and said, Tell Dante we have a location and a time. Then she went to the restroom at the end of Sandra's hallway, the single occupancy one with the lock on the door, and she stood in front of the mirror for about 45 seconds and looked at the face of a woman who was 8 months pregnant and about to walk into a meeting with the man who had weaponized her marriage. The woman in the mirror looked tired. Her eyes were clear. She ran cold water over her wrists, the way she used to do when she needed to think an old habit, something she'd done since college, the cold bringing everything into sharper focus. She turned off the tap. She unlocked the door. There was work to do, and she was the only one who could do it. And the version of herself who might have waited for someone else to handle it had walked out of a penthouse 6 weeks ago and not looked back, and that version was gone. And what remained was this, a woman who knew exactly what she had built and was not going to let anyone take it. Not Silas, not Celeste. And she walked back into Sandra's office and picked up her tote bag and looked at the card one more time, not the man who had once looked at her like she was an intrusion in her own marriage. She walked out of Sandra's office into the October afternoon and hailed a cab and sat in the back with her hand resting against her stomach and her eyes on the city going past and her mind already 3 days ahead, in a private club in Midtown, sitting across from a man she had never met who believed he understood what she was worth. He was about to find out he had significantly underestimated it. Thursday arrived, the way days arrive when you have been waiting for them without ceremony, without the dramatic weight the anticipation had loaded onto it. Just a morning that came after the night before and required you to get up and move through it. Amara was awake at 5:43. She had slept in pieces 2 hours. Then an hour, then another stretch that ended when the baby shifted position, and her lower back registered its objection with a persistence that no amount of repositioning resolved. She lay in the dark of the Upper West Side apartment and ran through the meeting in her mind the way she had run through it every night for 3 days. Not rehearsing lines, she didn't work that way. She was mapping contingencies. Every direction Silas could take the conversation, every variation of the offer, every pressure point he might try to use. She got up at 6 and stood in the kitchen, making tea she barely tasted, and looking at the street below where the morning was assembling itself, piece by piece, a delivery truck, a man walking a dog with the hunched forward posture of someone who had not had coffee yet, a woman in scrubs moving fast. Her phone showed one message from Dante, sent at 2:17 in the morning. Everything is ready on our end. The location is covered. You don't have to do this today if you need more time. She read it twice. The second time, she noticed what wasn't there: no direction, no instruction, no architecture of control around it. Just information and an exit she could take if she wanted. She typed back, "I'm ready. Don't contact me again until I come out." She put the phone down and went to get dressed. She chose carefully, not for Silas, for herself. A dark dress, clean lines, the kind of thing she wore when she needed to feel like the sharpest version of herself. Low heels, because her feet had been swelling, and she was not going to spend this meeting uncomfortable in ways she could control. Her hair down, which she almost never wore anymore, because it was the version of her that photographs showed from the earlier years of her marriage, and she wanted Silas, if he had done his research through imagery, to see something familiar. She looked at herself in the mirror. 8 months pregnant, flats on her feet, the particular quality of someone who has been running on interrupted sleep for weeks and has stopped apologizing for the evidence of it in her face. She picked up her bag and left. The club was on 54th Street, the kind of address that announced itself through restraint, no signage visible from the street, just a number beside a door that was very clean and very dark and had the specific quality of a door that did not open for people who weren't expected. It opened for Amara because someone had called ahead. She did not examine that too carefully. Inside, low light, dark wood, the smell of leather and money, and the particular quiet of places that have been designed to ensure that conversations inside them stay inside them. A host who looked at Amara with practiced neutrality, noting her condition, filing it, showing nothing, and led her through a corridor to a private dining room at the back. Silas Vane was already there. She had built a picture of him from the fragments Marco and Lee had assembled mid-60s, self-made in the specific way that meant he had started with very little and turned ruthlessness into an operational philosophy before he had the vocabulary to name it. The photographs were 5 years old and slightly formal, the kind taken for contexts where you want to project legitimacy. The man in the room matched the photographs structurally but not in texture. He was lean in the way that men who have spent decades under pressure become lean, not fitness, but the consumption of softness by sustained tension. His hair was gray and cut short, and he wore a suit that had been made for him specifically. His hands, when he looked up from the table, were still. Still hands on a man like this meant either deep calm or deep control. The difference was not immediately visible from the outside. "Mrs. Bellecourt," he said. "Whitfield," she said. "I'm using my maiden name." Something moved briefly in his expression. Approval, she thought. Not of her, specifically of the detail. He was the kind of man who cataloged details and responded to accuracy. Of course. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please." She sat. The chair was comfortable, of course it was. Everything in this room was designed to lower resistance. A server appeared. Water was poured. She did not order anything else, and neither did he, and the server left with the specific soundlessness of someone trained to be furniture. Silas looked at her for a moment with the direct, unhurried regard of a man who was comfortable with silence and used it as a tool. She looked back at him and used the same tool. "You know who I am," he said finally. "I do now." She rested her hands on the table, folded loosely. "You spent 14 months using your daughter to dismantle my marriage. I know who you are." He didn't flinch. He absorbed it the way you absorbed something you were expecting. "I understand why you'd frame it that way." "How would you frame it?" "As an opportunity I identified." He leaned back slightly. "Your husband's organization has a structural weakness. Not the part of it you think, not the side that operates in shadows. That side is actually quite resilient. The vulnerability is the legitimate infrastructure, the financial network, the business relationships. He paused. Which you built, substantially alone, with less recognition than the work warranted. Amara said nothing. I'm aware of what you've done for Bellacourt Holdings over 4 years, Silas continued. Not because of what Celeste observed that filled in some gaps, but the foundation of what I know I assembled through other means. The Boston Partnership, the restructuring of the real estate subsidiary, revenue tracking, the Chicago investor relationships. He looked at her steadily. I could tell you the numbers, what those relationships are worth, what your contribution to them specifically is worth, not what you were paid, not what Dante valued it at, but the actual market valuation of the skills and relationships you deployed. Amara's breathing was even. She was making it even deliberately, the way her doctor had told her to manage stress slowly, from the diaphragm, the kind of breathing that kept your voice level when your chest wanted to tighten. Tell me, she said. He told her. The numbers were accurate. That was the thing she had known was coming, and had still underestimated the impact of hearing someone say out loud, in a quiet room, the actual value of work she had done in rooms where she was occasionally treated as adjacent to the real business. The numbers were not inflated. That would have been a negotiating tactic, clumsy and transparent. These were real numbers, assembled by someone who had done the actual analysis, and they sat in the air between them with the particular weight of true things. What you've built, Silas said, deserves a structure that recognizes it, compensates it, gives you decision-making authority commensurate with your actual contribution. He let that settle. I can offer you that structure. Working for you, working with me. There's a real distinction. He leaned forward slightly. Not aggression engagement. The posture of someone who believes in what they're saying, which was its own kind of warning, because it meant this wasn't purely performance. My operations need someone who understands how to build legitimate infrastructure, how to cultivate relationships, how to structure financial systems that can withstand scrutiny, how to operate in the space between private capital and public-facing business. He looked at her. You've been doing exactly that for 4 years. Except you've been doing it for a man who told you to obey him or leave. The sentence landed. She had known it was coming. She had known, in the theoretical mapping of the conversation, that he would use this, that he had studied the night she left and understood what it could be leveraged into. She had prepared for it. Preparations did not make it land with less weight. The access codes for the financial system, she said, that's the practical ask. That's part of it. The codes are a key. What they open is a structure I'd want you to help integrate and rebuild under a different organization. Not extracted and dismantled. Rebuilt. He was precise. I'm not interested in destroying what you created. I'm interested in what it becomes if you're actually in charge of it. The room was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city made its noise, but in here the insulation was total. Amara looked at Silas for a long moment. She thought about the recording device that had been fitted, with considerable technical ingenuity by Marco's team, into the frame of the reading glasses she was wearing. She thought about the monitoring station 3 blocks away, where Lee and Marco and 2 of Dante's security men were listening to every word of this conversation in real time. She thought about the legal team that had the threshold language, prepared the specific phrases that, once spoken into the record, would constitute the solicitation they needed. Silas had just spoken all of them. The financial systems I built, Amara said, carefully, are interconnected with Bellacourt Holdings' legitimate operations in ways that can't be simply extracted. You know that. I know that the extraction would require time and technical cooperation. Yes. And you're asking me to provide that cooperation. I'm offering you a reason to provide it. There's a difference. He held her gaze. You have no remaining obligation to Dante Bellacourt. He made that choice. The only question is what you build next, and with whom, and whether that reflects what you're actually worth. Outside in the monitoring station on 51st Street, Lee was already on the phone to the attorney's office. Inside the dining room, Amara unfolded her hands. She placed them flat on the table. I want to be honest with you, she said. Silas's expression registered the shift in register. A fractional alertness. The codes you've been trying to access have been rotated 3 times since I left the Bellacourt household. What Celeste photographed is 6 months out of date. She watched his face. You've been building on credentials that don't work. I changed them before I even knew who you were. The stillness in Silas's hands changed quality, which means, Amara continued, that everything you've positioned Celeste to do the planted evidence, the document photography, the approach through Rourke, it was all built on information that expired before the operation began. She held his gaze. Thought you should know that before you made any further decisions about how to proceed. Silas was quiet. That was when the door opened. Not the server. Two men, the kind of men that a person running the kind of operation Silas ran kept available for moments when conversations went directions they hadn't been planned for. They were in suits, and they moved to positions on either side of the room with the economy of professionals, and the room went from a private lunch to something else entirely in about 4 seconds. Amara did not move. She had known this was also a contingency. She and Marco had discussed it specifically. If Silas brought security, and the conversation reached a point of exposure, the security would shift from background to foreground. She had told Marco, if that happens, wait, don't move early. The evidence isn't complete until he responds to the disclosure. You're recording this conversation, Silas said. Yes. He looked at her with an expression that had moved past the controlled assessment he'd maintained through the early part of the meeting. Not anger, something colder and more considered. The look of a man who is recalculating against new information. You came here to collect a confession. I came here because you invited me, Amara said. I came here with information. What you do with it is your choice. The evidence I have against you is fabricated. Your own daughter manufactured it, and Marco Reyes's team has the technical documentation proving it. She kept her voice at a consistent level. Not aggressive, not frightened, just precise. Whatever you were planning to use against me publicly will instead form part of the legal case against your operation. The attorney my husband employs has had the documentation since Monday. The word husband fell out of her again, the same way it had in Sandra's office, without premeditation. She didn't correct it. Silas looked at her for a long moment. The men on either side of the room had not moved. The silence in the dining room was the kind that has weight and texture. You're 8 months pregnant, Silas said. The observation was not kind. It was the specific kind of statement that is designed to be a reminder of vulnerability, of physicality, of limitation of what a person in her condition could and could not do. Yes, Amara said, and I'm still the most dangerous person in this room. Because everything you needed, I have, and everything you built, I've just described to a recording that is currently being monitored by 3 attorneys and 2 federal contacts my husband's legal team activated yesterday morning. She paused. Codes, the systems, the relationships, none of it is accessible to you. Not today, not after this meeting, not through any channel Celeste gave you. She held his gaze. You have nothing. The man on her left side moved, not toward her. Toward the door, a shift of position that was preparatory, the muscle memory of someone who has been given a signal she hadn't detected. She saw it happen and felt her body understand it, before her mind did a cold drop in her chest, the specific alarm of realizing that a situation has moved outside the parameters you prepared for. Silas looked at the man and made a small, precise gesture with 2 fingers. The man stopped. I am not, Silas said carefully, going to make the mistake of compounding this. He looked back at Amara. His voice had gone very flat, not defeated, but controlled in the way of someone who has accepted a loss and is already processing what comes after. You're more thorough than I gave you credit for. Most people are, Amara said. When you dismiss them long enough. A beat. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He most smiled not warmly, not with concession, but with the specific appreciation of a man who encounters competence in a context where he had expected compliance. Dante Bellecourt is a fool, he said. He's learning, she said. She stood up. Her back protested the movement, and she did not show it. She picked up her bag from the floor beside the chair, and she looked at Silas one more time. Your people photographed confidential documents. Your daughter planted false evidence and committed fraud. You solicited industrial espionage in a recorded setting. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. Spend the next 72 hours talking to your attorneys. She walked to the door. The man who had moved earlier was still there. She stopped in front of him. He was a foot taller than her, and he looked at her with the blank evaluation of someone waiting for instruction. "Move," she said. He looked at Silas. Silas looked at Amara for one final moment, with something in his expression that she could not cleanly categorize, not respect exactly. Something adjacent to it and more complicated. He nodded once. The man stepped aside. Amara walked out of the dining room, through the corridor, past the host who noted her departure with the same practiced neutrality. He'd noted everything else, and out through the dark door onto 54th Street, where the October air hit her like something physical, and the city went about its business around her, with total indifference. She walked half a block before she stopped. She stood on the sidewalk and put one hand against the front of a building, just briefly, just long enough to let her knees do what they wanted to do, which was shake, and to let them finish doing it so she could walk normally to the car that Marco had waiting on the corner. The shaking lasted about 30 seconds. She breathed through it, in, out, the cold air doing what cold air does. Then she stood upright and walked to the corner. Car door opened before she reached it. Marco was in the front passenger seat, and he turned when she got in, and his face had the specific quality of a man who has been holding himself very still for an hour and has just been given permission to exhale. "You okay?" he said. The man by the door moved. "You saw that?" "We saw it." Nobody came out. He stopped when Silas signaled. It was a test. She leaned her head back against the seat. "Did we get everything?" "Everything. Lee's already coordinating with the contacts." Marco looked at her. "Amara, are you okay?" She looked at the ceiling of the car. Her back was a sustained complaint. Her hands were still slightly cold from the adrenaline. The baby had been still through the whole meeting, which happened sometimes a quiet hour followed by a very active one, and was now making up for it with a series of movements that felt like strong objections to the morning's proceedings. "I'm okay," she said. And then, because Marco had been in her life peripherally for 7 years, and had the discretion of a man who had learned to distinguish between performances and truth, "I'm tired." "Yeah," Marco said. "I know." He turned back to the front and said something quiet to the driver, and the car pulled out into traffic. Amara watched the city go past. 54th Street becoming 53rd. Then the park, then the familiar topography of the Upper West Side, assembling itself outside the window. She had her hand on her stomach without deciding to put it there. She thought about Silas's voice, saying Dante Bellecourt is a fool. She thought about her own voice, saying he's learning. She thought about the word husband falling out of her twice in three days without meditation, and what that meant, and whether she was going to examine it right now or file it in the place where she put things that required more stillness than she currently had. She filed it. Her phone showed a message from Dante, sent 6 minutes ago, which meant he'd been told she was out of the building and had waited exactly 6 minutes before. "Marco says you're in the car. I'll be at the brownstone." No questions, no direction, just location. She put the phone in her bag. The brownstone was warm when she arrived. Someone had turned the heat on and made coffee that she could smell from the hallway, and there was a glass of water on the table in the main room and a blanket on the chair nearest the window that had not been there during the planning meetings, which meant someone had put it there between then and now for reasons that were entirely practical and also somehow not. Dante was standing near the window, not pacing standing. She noted the difference, because it was unusual for him to be genuinely still without it being a controlled stillness. This was the other kind. Lee was on the phone in the other room. Marco came in behind Amara and went immediately to Lee, which left the main room with 2 people and the particular quality of air that gathers around unfinished things. Dante looked at her. She set her bag down on the table. She did not say, "I told you I could handle it," even though the sentence was available. It was the kind of sentence that had a short life, satisfying for a moment, and then just noise. "Silas had 2 men in the room," she said. "One of them moved when I disclosed the recording." Dante's jaw tightened. He called them off. He accepted the loss. She pulled out the chair nearest her and sat down. Because her back was no longer making requests, it was issuing demands. He's not going to retaliate directly. He's too calculated for that, and he has too much exposure now. His next move is containment. Containment means lawyers. Yes, which is where we want him. She looked up at Dante. He was still near the window, which was farther than felt natural for the conversation, and she thought he was probably aware of that and maintaining it deliberately. maintaining the distance she'd asked for, the space she'd asked him to respect. The moment he lawyers up in response to today, he's acknowledging the interaction happened, which locks the record. Lee's already building from the recording, Dante said. The solicitation language is clean. She said that before you got here. Good. A pause. Celeste? Amara asked. She left New York 4 days ago. We're tracking her through financial activity. She's in Chicago, which is where Silas's operation is headquartered. She's not going to surface publicly. He paused. Not voluntarily. She'll be named in the legal filings. Yes. Then she'll surface whether she wants to or not. Amara looked at her hands. They had stopped being cold. Whatever she told herself about why she did this, I don't think she factored in what it would look like when it was all laid out. Dante was quiet for a moment. Then she knew what she was doing. I know. I'm just saying she didn't think about afterward. She looked up. Most people don't. They think about the act, not what it looks like from the outside once it's over. He held her gaze. She held his. The air between them had the quality of a room after a long rain-cleared, slightly altered. Not the same as before. You said husband, Dante said. Twice. This week. The silence that followed that sentence was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of something that has been in a room for a while and is
finally being
acknowledged. I noticed, Amara said. I'm not using it as an argument. He said it with the carefulness of someone who has been practicing this, who has been working, in the weeks since she left, on the difference between saying what he needed to say and using what he said as leverage. I just noticed. I know you noticed. She looked at the glass of water on the table. Someone put a blanket on that chair. A beat. It's cold in here, Dante said. The heat is on. It was cold when I got here. I didn't know how long you'd be. He paused. It seemed like a useful thing to Dante. He stopped. Thank you, she said. For the blanket. The sentence was small. She meant more than the blanket, and they both knew it, and neither of them made that explicit. Because making it explicit would be the wrong next step, and they were both, finally, understanding what the wrong next steps looked like. Lee came back into the room with Marco. They had the particular energy of people who have completed the first phase of something and are ready to brief. Amara pulled the blanket off the chair and put it around her shoulders and picked up this glass of water and looked at Lee. Tell me where we are, she said. Lee opened her folder. Outside, the city went on doing what the city did. The October light was thinning toward afternoon. Somewhere across the park, in an Upper West Side apartment that had become, over the past 6 weeks, the first place that was entirely Amara's own, a nursery chair was not yet assembled because she hadn't gotten to it yet, because there had been other things demanding attention, because a woman who is building something new does it one piece at a time and not all at once. She sat at the table with the blanket around her shoulders and listened to Lee and held the glass of water and let the afternoon move around her. And the baby, who had been making her objections to the morning known for the past hour, finally stilled. Quiet, both of them, just for a moment. Then Lee said, "There's one more thing." And the room shifted. And the afternoon, which had almost felt like it was settling into something manageable, snapped back to attention like a wire under sudden tension, because Lee was looking at Amara with the expression of a woman who has been holding a piece of information back until the right moment and has just determined that the right moment is now. Silas filed something this morning, Lisa said. Before your meeting, before he could have known how the meeting would go. She set a document on the table. He filed it as a preemptive move, the kind of thing you file when you're prepared for a scenario where your operation gets exposed and you need something in your hand. Amara looked at the document. He filed a claim, Lee said carefully, asserting that the financial systems architecture created under Bellecourt Holdings between 4 years ago and 6 weeks ago was developed using proprietary methodologies belonging to a Vane family enterprise, a shell entity incorporated, 7 years ago, 1 year before you began working on the Bellecourt systems. The room was very quiet. He's claiming, Lee continued, that the system you built was derived from intellectual property he owns, which would mean, Amara said slowly, that every contract, every relationship, every financial structure I created for Bellecourt Holdings is potentially subject to a legal challenge that could freeze the entire legitimate operation. She looked up from the document. He filed this morning. At 9:47, Lee confirmed. before the meeting, which means, Dante said from the window, and his voice had gone to the tone she recognized as the one he used when he was holding something very tightly, that, whether the meeting went our way or not, he had a second play already filed. Contingency, Marco said. Not a contingency, Amara said. She was looking at the document and seeing the structure of it. The way she saw all structures, the load-bearing points and the weak joints, and the places where something would hold, and the places where it would fail under pressure. He filed this to be found. If the meeting had gone his way, he would have withdrawn it quietly. Now that it hasn't, she stopped. He's going to let it sit. He's going to let it sit in the public record, where our financial partners can see it. It'll cause exactly the kind of uncertainty that's already been damaging us, Dante said. More than that. Amara set the document down. Her voice was very even. The shell entity he incorporated, 7 years ago, the one he's claiming, owns the proprietary methodology. I need to see the incorporation documents. Lee produced them from the folder. She had been thorough. Amara looked at the date. She looked at it again. Something shifted in her face, a movement so small that only someone who had spent years learning to read her would have caught it. Dante caught it. What? He said. She looked up at him across the table. In the afternoon light of the brownstone, with the blanket around her shoulders and the glass of water in front of her, and the document on the table, she looked at him with an expression he had seen very rarely, the expression of someone who has just found the thread that unravels everything, and is not yet certain whether pulling it will hold the whole thing together or tear it completely apart. This entity was incorporated 7 years ago, she said. Yes. I started working on the Bellecourt systems 4 years ago. Yes. 7 years ago, Amara said, I was finishing my MBA. I wrote my thesis on financial infrastructure design for private capital organizations. She paused. The methodology I used for the Bellecourt systems is directly derived from the framework in that thesis. She looked at the incorporation documents. Silas incorporated this entity using my thesis as the foundation for its claimed intellectual property. The room did not make any sound. He didn't just study me, Amara said. He built his legal claim on work I did before I ever met Dante, before I ever heard the name Bellecourt. Her hand pressed flat against the table. He's been planning this since before any of the rest of it began. Dante looked at the documents. Then he looked at her. The thesis, Marco said carefully. Where is it? Physically, digitally. University archive. My personal records. It's published. It's publicly accessible. She looked at Marco, which means it's also provably mine. Probably prior. Probably the origin of what he's claiming his shell entity owns. She stopped. His entire legal claim dissolves the moment we produce my thesis, alongside the incorporation timeline. So we produce it, Dante said. We produce it, Amara said, and it destroys his IP claim. But there's something else. She looked at the incorporation date again. 7 years ago, Silas built a legal entity around my academic work, which means someone gave him that thesis. Someone who had access to my academic records before I graduated, before I met Dante. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Not the silence of people processing information. The silence of people standing at the edge of something much larger than the room they were in. Someone introduced us, Amara said quietly. She looked at Dante. He looked at her. The charity event, he said. 14 months ago. Celeste was introduced through not Celeste. Amara shook her head slowly. Before that. Years before that. Think about how we met, Dante. Think about who was there. Think about who introduced us and who that person knew, and trace it back. The afternoon light in the brownstone was thin and exact, and it lay across the table between them, and neither of them moved, and the city outside went on with total. The name came to Dante in the specific way that certain names come not as a discovery, but as a confirmation of something the body already knew, and the mind had been refusing to articulate. Harrison Webb, he said. The name sat in the room. Marco's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just the fractional shift of a man whose internal inventory has just located something it hadn't known to look for. Amara was watching Dante's face. She had been watching it since she said, think about who introduced us. And she had seen the process happen, the way his eyes went slightly unfocused as he ran backward through time, the small tension at his jaw as he arrived at something, the stillness that followed arrival. Harrison Webb introduced you to me, she said, at the Columbia alumni reception, 8 years ago. He said you were a former student of his colleagues, that you were exceptional. Dante looked at the table. I didn't think anything of it. People introduce people. Harrison Webb has been on the Bellacourt Holdings Advisory Board for 6 years, Marco said slowly. He was building it out loud, the way you build a structure when you need to hear it take shape. He was on the selection committee for 2 of the financial partnerships Amara cultivated. He would have had access to her academic records. Through the Columbia Network, he sits on 3 university boards, including the business school. He gave Silas my thesis, Amara said. Not a question. He gave Silas your thesis, Dante said. And then he introduced us. And then he positioned himself inside Bellacourt Holdings, where he could watch what you built and report on it. The thing about truly long games, Amara thought, is that they require a specific kind of patience that most people do not have. Harrison Webb had attended their wedding, had sent a gift when she became pregnant, had sat in meetings where she presented financial strategy, and had looked at her with the measured appreciation of a man observing good work. He had been watching her for 8 years. He's the one who told Silas the codes were still active, Marco said. He's still on the advisory board. He would have had enough proximity to systems to believe the credentials hadn't been changed because the rotation was Amara's private protocol. Nobody else knew the schedule. He told Silas I still had active access, Amara said, which is why the operation moved when it did. Silas thought he had a window. Lee had her phone out. She was already pulling Harrison Webb's advisory board documentation, the access records, the meeting attendances. Her fingers moved quickly, and her face had the focused compression of someone constructing a legal argument in real time. He needs to be out of the building tonight, Dante said to Marco. Access suspended. All of it. He'll know something's happened. Yes. Dante looked at Marco. He'll know something's happened because something has happened. Pull his access and get me everything he's touched in the past 12 months. Marco was already on his phone, moving toward the other room. Amara sat at the table and looked at the incorporation documents in front of her and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them, the specific exhaustion of discovering that something you thought was accidental was in fact deliberate. That the meeting that changed the course of your life was engineered by someone who had read your graduate thesis and decided you were useful before you had any idea you were being evaluated. 8 years, she said. Dante looked at her. He heard what was underneath the number. I'm sorry, he said. And then, because he was learning the difference between saying it as transaction and meaning it as fact, I know that doesn't fix the timeline. I'm saying it anyway. She looked at him. Harrison Webb shook my hand at our wedding. I know. He asked about the baby. At the last advisory meeting I attended. Before everything he asked if we'd chosen a name. Dante was quiet. What kind of person does that, Amara said. Not a question directed at Dante. A question directed at the air, at the specific blankness that opens up when you try to understand a kind of patience and calculation that operates outside the range of normal human motivation. The kind who's been doing it long enough that it stops feeling like a contradiction, Dante said. He said it flatly, without the philosophical distance. That would have made it easier. I've known men like that. I've operated near men like that my whole life. He paused. I didn't see it in Webb because he wasn't pointed at me. He was pointed at you, and I wasn't looking at what was pointed at you. The sentence carried its own weight. He let it. Lee came back into the room. I need Amara to formally identify the thesis as her prior work assigned statement today that we can attach to the documentation challenging Silas's IP filing. The sooner we file the counter, the more effectively we freeze his claim before it can do additional damage to the partner relationships. Do it now, Amara said. Bring me what I need to sign. They worked through the afternoon and into the early evening. Lee drafted. Amara reviewed and amended with the precision of someone who had spent 4 years learning to read financial and legal documents for the specific language that creates exposure. Dante stayed in the room and did not offer opinions on the legal content. This was not his area, and he knew it. And for once, he did not try to exert authority in a space where his authority was not the relevant currency. At one point, Amara asked for something to eat, and the request was directed at no one in particular, and Dante went to the kitchen and found what was there and brought it back without comment. The gesture was so far outside his normal behavioral range that Marco, passing through the room, registered it with a slight widening of his eyes that he immediately corrected. Amara ate without acknowledging the gesture specifically, and Dante did not require acknowledgement. He was learning slowly, and with the difficulty of any habit, running against the grain of a long-established pattern, that the point of doing something was sometimes just the doing of it, and not the recognition. By 6:15, Lee had a counterfiling ready for the IP claim, a formal legal complaint incorporating the recording from the private club, and a preliminary brief addressing the planted evidence using Marco's technical documentation. She walked Amara each through gate component with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the client needed to own the show picture. Amara signed where she was required to sign. Her handwriting was steady. Her back was a sustained low complaint that she had been managing with the technique of acknowledging it and then redirecting attention, which worked for limited periods and then stopped working and then had to be applied again. At 6:47, Marco came back into the main room, with his phone held at a specific angle that meant the call he'd just ended had produced something significant. Harrison Webb resigned from the advisory board. 20 minutes ago, Marco said. Effective immediately. No explanation in the communication. Dante looked at him. He's been told. Either someone warned him, or he's been monitoring his access privileges and saw the suspension happen. Either way, he's gone. Marco paused. He's booked a flight. Tonight. International. Let him go, Amara said. Both men looked at her. We have what we need from him in the documents and the timeline. Chasing him across a border gives his attorney something to work with and costs us time we should be spending on the Silas filing. She looked at Dante. Let him go. He'll surface this in the legal proceedings whether he's here or not. Dante held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded at Marco. Marco made a call. The brownstone emptied gradually. Lee left first, with the filing documents and the specific focused efficiency of a woman who had 3 more hours of work ahead of her and no intention of being distracted from it. The 2 security men left with Marco. The driver was outside. It was 7:23 when the room held only Dante and Amara. She was still at the table. She had not moved toward leaving, which Dante noticed and did not comment on. Her coat was over the back of the chair beside her. The blanket was still around her shoulders, slightly askew from hours of use. The glass of water in front of her had been refilled twice during the afternoon by various people, and was now half empty. Dante sat down across from her for the first time that day. He had been standing for most of it. He was tired in the particular way that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained vigilance, the weariness of a long attention. They sat in the quiet of the brownstone for a moment, without speaking. I'm going to tell you something, Amara said, and I need you to hear it without responding immediately. Can you do that? Yes. She looked at her hands on the table. When I was sitting across from Silas this afternoon, and he said the things he said about what I built and what it's worth, I didn't feel vindicated. I know that's what should make sense. That I would finally hear someone acknowledge it and feel justified. She paused. I felt angry. Not at him. At the years. At the fact that a man I'd never met, who had spent 8 years planning to use me, understood the value of what I'd done more clearly than the man I was actually doing it for. Dante did not respond immediately. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression that had no management in it at all. I knew, he said finally. I want you to know that I knew. Not in the way you deserve to have it known. Not spoken, not formally recognized, not structured in the way you structured everything else. But I knew. He stopped. That's not an excuse. Knowing something and not acting on it correctly is the same as not knowing it in the ways that count. Yes, she said. It is. The business would have deteriorated without you. Partnerships you managed, I would have lost 3 of them in the first year. I knew that. I let myself rely on it instead of acknowledging it. He looked at the table. I let a lot of things work without examining whether the person making them work was being treated right, because the things were working, and examining it would have required me to admit something about the way I was operating that I didn't want to admit. The room was very quiet. What wouldn't you admit? Amara said. He looked up. That I needed you more than I was willing to let you see. Because needing someone in the way I needed you, not just practically, but in every other way felt like exposure. And I had spent my entire life treating exposure as a threat. He said it simply. No scaffolding around it. I chose Celeste. Not because of what she offered. Because she didn't require anything from me that I wasn't willing to give. Because she was safe in the way that people are safe when they don't actually matter to you. Amara absorbed that. And the night you came to the penthouse, she said, when you looked at me and said what you said, I was afraid, Dante said. Not of you. Of what your face looked like. Of what I saw in it when you walked in. He held her gaze. I said what I said because it was the thing most likely to make you leave before you made me say anything true. The silence between them was not empty. It was the most substantive silence the conversation had produced. You succeeded, Amara said. Yes. And then you spent 6 weeks realizing what that success had cost you. Yes, a pause. And you spent 6 weeks building something entirely yours, and navigating a threat I created for you, and having a pregnancy I should have been present for, and you did all of it with a composure that He stopped, tried again. I have been in rooms with the most controlled, disciplined people in this city for 20 years. I have never seen anyone manage what you managed in the past 6 weeks, and maintain what you maintained while managing it. Amara looked at him for a long moment. Don't romanticize it. I cried in a clinic bathroom in week 3. I ordered food I didn't eat for 2 weeks because cooking felt like too much. I called Sandra at 11 at night twice because the silence in the apartment was doing something to me that I couldn't name. I know. You don't know. No, he said. I mean, I know now. Marco told me some of it. Not to report to me. I think he told me because he needed to tell someone who should already have known. He paused. He was right to tell me. Amara looked at her water glass. Then she looked back at him. The baby's name is Nora. Dante was still. I picked it in the 2nd month. I didn't tell anyone. She said it the way she said most important things, simply, without performance. I've been saying it to her at night. When I can't sleep, thought you should know. He didn't say anything for a moment. She watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do in a long time, not fall apart. Nothing so dramatic, just open, slightly, the way a window opens in a room that has been closed too long. Nora, he said. Once, slowly, the way you nod when something is enough and more would ruin it. The legal filings landed the next morning, with the precision that Lee delivered all things. The counter to Silas's IP claim was filed at 9:17, accompanied by Amara's signed identification of her thesis as prior work, time-stamped archival documentation from Columbia's records office, and a legal brief that the attorney filing it described in a call to Sandra Peel as the cleanest chain of provenance I've worked with in 15 years. Silas's attorneys received it by 10. By noon, they had filed for an extension on the original claim, the legal equivalent of a man who has walked into a room confidently and is now looking for a graceful way to back out of it. The recording from the private club meeting was formally submitted to the relevant authorities the same afternoon, coordinated through Bellacourt's federal contacts with the kind of documentation that made the chain of custody unassailable. Marco had been meticulous about this, specifically because Amara had been meticulous about it. She had asked, in the planning stage, for the recording protocol to be built to evidentiary standards rather than simply to information-gathering ones. She had been thinking, even then, about what happened after. Celeste's communications, the technical evidence of document photography, and the planted evidence timeline were submitted as supplementary material. Lee wrote the accompanying brief. It was 43 pages, and it had no weaknesses that Silas's legal team could identify quickly, which meant they couldn't respond quickly, which meant the public record was assembling itself in only one direction. By the end of the week, 2 of the 3 financial partners who had been quietly withdrawing had made contact with Bellacourt Holdings' business office directly. One of them asked specifically to speak with Amara. She took the call from her apartment, sitting at the small desk she'd set up near the window that had become, over 6 weeks, the center of her operational life. Partner, a Boston-based managing director named Calloway, who had been one of the first relationships she'd built 4 years ago, spoke to her for 22 minutes. He was careful, and she was direct, and at the end of the call he said, with the specific relief of a man who has been waiting for a conversation to go differently than he feared, I'm glad you're still involved. She said, I appreciate that, and meant it without letting it fill more space than it deserved. She ended the call and sat at the desk for a moment. Still involved. She turned the phrase over. It was accurate, and also incomplete. She was involved in a way that was not yet formally defined, which was a detail that needed to be addressed, and she was going to address it on her timeline and in her terms, and not before she was ready. She had learned something in the past 6 weeks about the difference between being patient and being passive. She had always been patient. She had sometimes confused that patience with an absence of demands. She was not going to make that confusion again. Nora arrived on a Tuesday, 17 days earlier than the projected date, which the doctor called early but not concerning, and which Amara called typical because Nora had spent the last 2 months making her position known, and it followed that she would have opinions about timing. The labor was 10 hours, not easy. Nothing about it was easy in the way that people who have not experienced it sometimes imagine it might be. It was 10 hours of the most sustained and specific physical difficulty Amara had ever navigated, and she navigated it with the same fundamental approach. She brought to everything one piece at a time, fully present in each piece, not spending energy on the next one until the current one was complete. Dante was there because Amara had said he could be. That was the specific grammar of it, and she had been precise about it in the conversation 3 days before. When she had told him the due date, and he had asked, very carefully, with the care of a man who has learned to wait for permission, and is still adjusting to how different that feels from his normal mode of operating, whether she would want him present. She had said yes. He could be present. He had been in the room the entire 10 hours. He had not tried to manage anything. He had gotten ice chips when she asked for them, and not when she didn't. He had held her hand when she reached for something to hold and released it without comment the moment she pulled away. When the doctor gave instructions, Dante listened to the doctor. When Amara gave instructions, Dante listened to Amara. At 2:47 in the morning, Nora arrived. The sound she made was immediate and indignant, and entirely her own, and Amara, who had been running on sustained will for 10 hours, heard it and made a sound in response that was not language and did not need to be. The nurse put Nora on Amara's chest, and the room narrowed to that specific point, to the weight and warmth of 6 pounds 11 ounces of person who had spent 9 months becoming, and was now here actual, with opinions about the temperature and the light and the immediate absence of the environment she had just left. Amara held her daughter. She looked at her face, the scrunched, ancient, furiously present face of a newborn who has just arrived somewhere and has not yet decided what she thinks of it, and felt something that was larger than any category she had available for it. She looked up. Dante was standing at the edge of the room, near the wall, in the specific position of a man who is trying to take up as little space as possible. He was looking at the baby. His face had done the thing she had watched it almost do twice. In the past weeks it had opened, but this time it did not stop partway. His jaw was set, because he was holding something in his jaw to keep his face from showing the fullest extent of what was happening in it. And she could see both things simultaneously, the holding and the thing being held. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and stood at the side of the bed and looked at Nora for a moment without speaking. "She has your ears," Amara said. "I was going to say something," he said. His voice had a texture it normally didn't have. "But I don't—" He stopped. "I don't have the right words." "You don't need words right now." He looked at Amara. "Can I?" "Yes." He reached down and touched Nora's hand with one finger, the careful, almost formal touch of a man who is aware of the fragility of small things and is not going to pretend otherwise. And Nora, with the reflexive completeness of newborns, closed her fingers around his. He stood there and let a 7-pound person hold his finger and did not speak. Amara watched him and let herself feel what she felt about it without arguing with the feeling. She was too tired to argue with anything, and she had learned, over the past 6 weeks, that some things were better examined without argument first. The weeks that followed were not cinematic in any sense that would satisfy a person hoping for neatness. Amara went home to her apartment. Dante did not come with her. He helped her carry things in once, at her request, because there were items that required more than one person to navigate through a doorway. And then he left when the carrying was done, because she had not asked him to stay, and he was not going to position himself into her space without being asked. She was tired in the way that new mothers are tired, which is a category of tired, with no adequate comparison. She slept when Nora slept, and was awake when Nora was awake, and operated in between on the specific autopilot of a person whose body has been replaced by a functional machine running on insufficient fuel. Sandra came once a week with updates on the Silas legal proceedings, which were moving with the slow, grinding certainty of a process that has adequate documentation and no real defense to work against. Silas's attorneys were doing what good attorneys do, in untenable situations managing the damage, delaying the reckoning, looking for angles. There were no good angles. Lee had been thorough. Celeste resurfaced in the proceedings as a named party in the formal complaint. Her attorneys made an opening approach, suggesting cooperation in exchange for considerations, which Lee evaluated and brought to Amara, who read it and said, "What does cooperation actually get us?" And Lee said, "Confirmation of what we already have and a faster timeline." And Amara said, "Offer limited consideration for the timeline. Nothing that protects her from the civil component." Lee made a note and left. Dante sent things, not to her apartment, to Sandra's office, addressed to Amara with a formality that was deliberate. Documents related to Nora's financial provisions. The asset transfers he had described the night in the penthouse, executed without conditions. A brief note, separate from the legal paperwork, in his handwriting. These are for her, not for negotiation. Signs where required and keep the rest. She signed where required. Harrison Webb resurfaced in a different jurisdictions 3 weeks after his departure, which is approximately how long it takes for international legal coordination to locate a man who is not trying particularly hard to be found. He hired expensive lawyers. The expensive lawyers read the documentation Lee's had assembled and had a quiet conversation with their client that resulted in a formal cooperation agreement signed 11 days later. Webb's cooperation confirmed the final elements of the Silas timeline, specifically the mechanism by which Silas had obtained Amara's academic work and the channel through which Webb had fed information about the Bellacourt financial systems over a period of approximately 3 years. 3 years. Amara read the confirmed timeline and sat with it for the amount of time it deserved and then put it down. She had a daughter who needed feeding. The timeline could be what it was. Dante came to see Nora every few days. At times Amara confirmed in advance, with a consistency that she tracked, without announcing that she was tracking it. He arrived when he said he would. He left when she indicated the visit was complete. He did not use the visits as occasions for conversations about anything other than Nora, unless Amara opened another subject, which occasionally she did, and on those occasions he answered what was asked, and did not expand beyond the answer. He was learning a new way of being in a space. She could see the effort of it, not because he was performing effort, but because she knew what his natural mode looked like, and this was different. And the difference required something from him that did not come easily. One evening, 6 weeks after Nora was born, he arrived at the apartment and found Amara on the floor of the living room, because she had sat down there with Nora 20 minutes earlier and not gotten up, and the floor was actually quite comfortable. And Nora was awake and looking at the ceiling with the focused intensity of a person discovering that ceilings exist. Dante looked at the two of them on the floor for a moment. Then he sat down on the floor too, not next to Amara. A few feet away where Nora could see him, because Nora had begun to track faces with the deliberate concentration of someone practicing a new skill. They sat on the floor in silence for a while. "She looks like herself," Dante said. "She always has." Amara watched Nora watch the ceiling. Even in the ultrasound, she was already herself. He looked at Nora for a moment. "I've been restructuring the business, the legitimate side. I've been working with the board on a formal structure that doesn't depend on informal arrangement to function." He paused. "It's better. It should have been this way for a long time." Amara said nothing for a moment. "Then what does the restructuring look like?" He described it. She listened. She asked 2 questions. He answered them accurately, without inflation, and she recognized the shape of what he'd built and understood it had been designed with the consultation of people who understood the architecture she'd created, which meant he had found a way to preserve the infrastructure without depending on her continued presence within it. He had made it so that her involvement going forward would be a choice. She looked at him. He was looking at Nora. "You did that deliberately," she said. "Yes. So that it couldn't be leverage." "So that it couldn't be leverage," he confirmed. "If you want to be involved formally, compensated correctly, with the title that reflects what the work actually is, the position exists, and it's yours. If you don't, The structure functions without you. He paused. I should have built it that way from the beginning. Yes, she said. You should have. He nodded. Nora made a sound that was not quite a word, and was not quite a complaint, and was entirely her own specific language, and both of them looked at her. And for a moment, the floor of a small apartment on the Upper West Side was the exact location of the whole world. I need more time, Amara said. Not to the room to him. I know. That's not a door closing. I want you to hear that. He looked at her. She held his gaze. I hear it, he said. She looked back at Nora. She's going to be the kind of person who argues about everything, Amara said. She already does. She gets that from her mother. Amara almost smiled. She gets that from both of us. He let himself acknowledge that with a slight movement of his expression that was not quite a smile either, but was in that direction, and they sat in the quiet of the apartment, while Nora conducted her investigation of the ceiling with the thoroughness of someone who intends to understand it fully before moving on to anything else. 3 months later, on an evening when the city had shed the last of winter and was doing the tentative, unconvincing thing it did in early March that resembled spring, without fully committing to it, Amara walked into the penthouse for the first time since the night she'd left. Dante had asked her to come. He had asked through Sandra formally, in a way that gave her every opportunity to decline. He had said there was something he wanted to show her, and that she could bring Sandra if she wanted, and that it had nothing to do with the legal proceedings, which were in their final phase and did not require her personal presence. She came alone. The penthouse was different in the way that spaces are different when the person who made them feel like themselves has been absent from them, everything in the same position. Everything slightly off. She noticed it in the way you notice the silence after a long sound. Dante met her at the elevator. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping perfectly, which was a condition she recognized, because she also had not been sleeping perfectly, though her reasons were different. He looked like himself, and also like someone who had been doing the slow, invisible work of changing what himself meant. It did not show dramatically. It showed in the accumulation of small things. He said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "What did you want to show me?" He walked her down the hallway, past the guest rooms, to the door at the end. The nursery. He opened it. She stood in the doorway. He had finished it. Not changed it, finished it. Crib she had chosen was assembled. The rocking chair from the estate sale was there, in the position she had imagined for it. The bookshelf with the picture books she had collected was against the wall, and there were a few additions, not many, not intrusive. Just a small number of books added to the ones she'd chosen, in the same style, kind of books someone would choose if they had paid close attention to the ones already there. She stood in the doorway of the room she had never seen completed, and felt the years in it not as weight exactly, but as presence, evidence of time that had moved and changed what it touched. She stepped inside. She walked to the rocking chair and put her hand on the back of it. The wood had been refinished. She had left it slightly rough on one edge, intending to sand it later. Someone had sanded it. "You finished it," she said. Yes. He was in the doorway. Not in the room, in the doorway, at the threshold. "I didn't change anything you chose. I just completed what was missing." She turned and looked at him. He was holding something. She hadn't noticed it when she came in a small box. The kind that contains a ring, which she recognized because she had seen this specific box before, the night she walked out, sitting on his desk after she placed it there. "I'm not going to ask you anything tonight," Dante said. "I just want you to know that this is where it is. When you're ready, if you're ready, it's here." He set the box on the shelf beside the picture books. "It's not pressure. It's just where it belongs." She looked at the box on the shelf. She looked at the room around her, the room she had built piece by piece without making it an event that had sat closed for months, while two people tried to survive the consequences of failing each other. That was now finished, quiet, waiting for the person it had been made for. She looked at Dante. He looked back at her from the doorway, with his hands at his sides and nothing in his expression that was asking for anything. He had learned, finally, completely, at the cost of everything that learning it had required, how to want something without turning the wanting into demand. "Nora should see this room," Amara said. "Yes," he said. "She should. I'll bring her on Thursday." He nodded. She looked once more at the box on the shelf. She did not pick it up. She was not ready to pick it up, and she knew the difference between not ready and not ever, and she was done, pretending those two things were the same. She walked toward the doorway. He stepped back to give her room to pass. She stopped beside him for a moment. They were close enough that she could see the specific tiredness in his face and the specific determination underneath it. And she thought about the man who had looked at her in this apartment like she was an intrusion. And she thought about the man who had sat on her living room floor and watched his daughter fantasy seating. And she understood that both of those men were true and that the distance between them was not erased, but was real, was work, actual work, the kind that doesn't get done all at once. She put her hand on his arm, just for a moment, the way you touch something to confirm it's real. Then she walked to the elevator. He didn't follow. The elevator opened and she stepped in, and the doors closed. And she rode down 17 floors in the quiet. And when she came out into the lobby and through the door and onto the street, the March air was cold and thin, and the city was doing what it always did, which was move, continuously, with total indifference to any particular person's particular reckoning. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not to shaking, not still in the way of someone suppressing movement, just standing, breathing, present in the specific way of someone who has come through something that cost what it cost, and is now, finally, on the other side of it, not unscathed, not unchanged, but upright, clear-eyed, and entirely her own. She hailed a cab. She went home to her daughter. The city closed behind her like water, and the night continued. And somewhere on the Upper West Side, a woman who had walked out of a penthouse with a wedding ring removed from her finger and a future completely unscheduled was now walking into her own apartment and lifting her daughter from the crib and standing at the window in the dark with the weight of her in her arms. And the city below them was full of people, building things and burning things and learning the difference. And Nora looked at the lights the way she looked at everything, with absolute attention, with the thoroughness of someone who intends to understand it all. And Amara held her and let the night be what it was. Enough.